Welcome to this week's webinar, What is an Offer of Coverage? The 5 most important things that you must know. My name is Kaya Bromley, and I am the president and founder of Your Obamacare Advisors, author of the book, The Employer's Guide to Obamacare, and this is another installment of our Countdown to Obamacare webinar series that we're doing every Thursday until the end of the year. And we're very excited today to have Ryan Mulder with us. He is a partner at the Healthcare Attorneys, and he's written and spoken extensively on the ACA, and we're very honored and excited to have him here today. Hi, Ryan. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Kay. How you doing?
I am great. And our sponsor of this Obamacare series is Freedom Care Benefits, an Affordable Care Act solution for around $100 per employee per month. And Freedom Care Benefits is a guaranteed ACA solution for employers, and it is a self-insured program that if you haven't heard about it and you've got an employer that has a large number of newly insured or new employees that they have to insure, I strongly recommend looking into that program. And with that, let's go into my warning that I give at the beginning of every webinar. Again, this is not a substitute for legal advice. If you would like to contact us after the webinar, we are happy to consult with you, either Ryan or myself. But this is not legal advice. All of the analysis that every employer needs to do is on an individual basis. So there's no blanket statements. And I know Ryan and I have been talking a lot that we're seeing a lot of scary things out there with different brokers and different companies making blanket statements about this or that. And we're going to get into some of those. And we want to just encourage everyone to be really careful when you hear things like that. But again, a reminder, the exchange is open on November 15th, and employers with over 100 full-time and full-time equivalent employees have to comply as of January 1st. So there is no more time to delay. So with that, let's jump right in. So Ryan, today we're going to talk about offers of coverage and why is it important. As we know, the offer of coverage is not talked about a whole lot specifically in the ACA. It's given very little bit of coverage, but it's one of the most important concepts of the ACA because basically everything hinges on it. So with that, Ryan, I'm going to let you get started in talking about the penalties that are related to the offer of coverage.
Right. Essentially, both of the Section 4980H penalties all hinge on whether you're making a proper offer of coverage to your full-time employees and their dependents. And if you're not offering the coverage properly, you could be potentially subject to a penalty under Section 4980HA. I mean, if the offer is improper to everyone, it's going to be Section 4980HA. But if it's improper to some, it's going to be Section 4980HB, potentially. So the offer is absolutely essential that you do this correctly.
And it's not, just like everything in the ACA, it's not as simple as it seems. The devil's always in the details, and what we think of as offer doesn't always mean the same thing under the ACA. It's what we call in the legal world a term of art. So in addition, so penalty A is a $2,000 penalty, penalty B is the $3,000 penalty, and then of course our favorite, the catch-all penalty, $100 per employee per day, and there's a whole laundry list of things that can trigger this one. And we did the calculation for an employer the other day to see what their penalties would be if they didn't find out about it for an entire year, which is going to be the case. If you are assessed a penalty, you often won't know that you were assessed it until you were in violation for at least a year. And if someone is assessed this penalty with 250 employees, this penalty plus the A penalty, it's over $7 million. And I mean, this is not something to ignore. This is a very serious thing that employers need to understand, and people who are advising employers, and it all hinges on the offer of coverage. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the pitfalls to avoid. While there is not a whole lot of guidance about what is an offer, we do have a little bit of guidance about what is not an offer. So, Ryan, let's talk a little bit about different things that someone might believe is an offer that is actually not an offer under the ACA.
Right.
So the first, let me do the first one, then I'm going to let you do the next three. So the first one is, this is the only one that's not an offer that's actually spelled out under the ACA, and that is if an employer provides coverage that doesn't qualify. In other words, it's not affordable, it doesn't provide minimum value, and it's provided at no cost to the employee as a condition of employment without giving them the right to decline, and not offering a bronze with it, then that is not considered an offer. So that's the only guidance that we were given. Other than that, Ryan, why don't you talk a little bit about the other things we know are not going to be considered an offer?
Right, so it's also not going to be considered an offer if you're offering a plan that just provides accepted benefits, vision, or dental, or just a plan that does not provide preventive health services. So if it does not provide preventive health services, it's not going to meet the MEC definition. So that's not going to be an offer of coverage. And also, if you're not offering coverage to 70% of your full-time employees in 2015, I guess technically you will be offering coverage to some, or theoretically you could be, but you're still going to be subject to the A penalty of $2,000 per year per employee. So that's something to keep in mind when offering coverage. You need to make sure you're classifying your employees correctly and offering the coverage to a sufficient number of full-time employees.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the offering to dependents. Ryan has written extensively about this issue, and in fact, we talked about it last week. And the thing that we want you to be aware of, and not many people are talking about it, is the penalties for not offering to dependents is kind of hidden. And so a lot of employers might think that they're not going to run afoul of this, but it really is one of the pitfalls, one of the places where I say the devil's in the details. So Ryan, can you talk a little bit about this concept of offering dependents and what the pitfall is for employers and how they can indirectly trigger a penalty?
Right. This is actually an interesting issue I wrote about last week. And each of the 4980H penalties can really be broken into three parts. The first part's talking about just what the penalty is, and it requires coverage to be offered to full-time employees and their dependents. The second part of the penalty is the trigger mechanism. And what's interesting is the trigger mechanism for the penalty, each 4980HA and 4980HB, says only full-time employees can trigger the penalty, and that occurs by the employer receiving a notice from the government. It's called a Section 1411 notice. But noticeably absent from the trigger mechanism is dependents. So technically, a dependent can never trigger a 4980H penalty. And then just to summarize, the third part of each of these penalties is just explaining how to calculate the penalty. So technically, a dependent can never trigger a 4980H penalty. However, the 95% rule, which is the 70% rule for 2015, clearly states to use that rule that you have to offer coverage to dependents as well as full-time employees. So while it's possible, while it's true that dependents can never trigger a 4980H penalty, we're recommending to all of our clients that you have to offer dependent coverage as well, because you're going to want the protection of the 95% rule or the 70% rule in 2015, because these rules are so technical that it's almost inevitable that you will mess up with one employee. And if you don't have the protection of the 95% rule, it could trigger the 4980HA penalty for all of your employees if you mess up with just one employee. And like like Kea frequently talks about, this penalty can be in the thousands, or it's going to be in the thousands, if not millions, if you're large enough.
Yeah, so this is a really scary one that we hope that you're paying attention to, and if you are advising employers, they really need to pay attention to this. And this one is a frustrating part of the law because if you're looking at it from the dependent's perspective, the insurance doesn't have to be affordable. So the dependent can be required to pay the full cost of the coverage, which seems unfair because the employer might think, you know, I'm just going to allow the dependent to go get insurance on the exchange and get a subsidy. The problem with that is if they do not offer to the dependents, they're going to just by adding the dependents often, the employer is going to kick themselves out of the 95% or the 70% compliance rule. So that's a really big deal here. And the next one is with regard to, I'm calling them contractor situations, but it's really any time that you've got multiple employers who one or many of them could be responsible for offering the coverage. At the end of the day, everyone's going to be called into the teacher's office or the principal's office to say who is responsible for offering the coverage. So for example, if I am using a staffing company and I have employees working for me who appear to be common law employees, and I say, well, the staffing company was supposed to be offering the coverage, I better make darn sure that the staffing company offered the coverage because when the IRS goes to figure out the penalties, they're going to come to me because they were working as my common law employee. So and this is the reason this is coming up so strong for me is I had a union client, or it was a contractor, but hiring union employees today. And they were saying, well, we can't get the information from the union to find out if they're being offered coverage. And I said, well, your choices are this. Either offer the coverage yourself or don't do business with that union anymore, because you don't have the option to just ignore it and say it's someone else's responsibility, because it's going to cost you a lot of money to unravel that later and argue over whose responsibility it was. So contractor situations does not get you out of any responsibility for offering coverage. You need to make sure that the responsible party is offering it. Ryan, anything else to add on that one? I know I kind of covered it.
No, I think that's just a really important issue, and it's important to know that if you are misclassifying your employees, there is no corrections process. So you could be subject to the 4980HA penalty, or you likely will be subject to the 4980HA penalty if you're not correctly classifying your employees. So it's something that is absolutely vital to do correctly.
You know, that's a really great point, because in my practice, I deal with a lot of IRS issues and tax audit issues. And your point about there is no correction process should be very well taken by everybody. You can't just go and say, oops, and it's good faith. The IRS is kind of strict liability. So if you violate these things, they're not going to care that you just made a mistake. You're just liable. So that was a great point. Thanks for making that point, Ryan. So let's talk about proving that you offered coverage. So if everything hinges on this offer of coverage, how are you supposed to prove it? And we have guidance finally from the IRS on this. And Ryan, I'm going to let you talk about the filing requirements that the IRS has told us about.
Right. Essentially, the IRS is in section 6055 and 6056 of the ACA requires reporting by employers regarding who it's offering minimum essential coverage to and the cost of the coverage. So essentially, the IRS is going to know if you're offering coverage to certain employees and if you're not offering coverage to certain employees. So I know a lot of employers in the past have played sort of an audit lottery of, we won't get caught if we're not 100% accurate, and we'll just take a chance on, if we get an audit, we'll just risk that chance. With these forms, which are actually, the forms are called the Form 1094 and Form 1095, and they're still being flushed out by the IRS. But these forms are going to let the auditors know who's complying and who's not complying with the law. And they're going to know with a high degree of accuracy who they should audit and who they should not audit.
Yep, and the purpose of it is so that they can enforce the individual mandate as well as the employer mandate. So it's not, and I agree, Ryan. I'm seeing with some of my clients too. You know, kind of, I like what you call the audit lottery. They're just saying that they offered the coverage, and they're saying, well, these people are illegal anyway. I don't, you know, and it opens up a whole other can of worms. But it's not something that they can just gloss over or that it's going to be fuzzy. This is a very specific form, and you're going to report every full-time employee that you have and whether or not you offered them and their dependents coverage. So there's no, they've taken all the guesswork out of this and any ability that anyone would have to fudge any numbers. It's going to be very easy for them to compare this to your payroll and to say, to be able to tell very clearly if you've offered coverage to the right percentage of people, and they're going to compare it to whatever measurement records that you've kept, and if you haven't kept them, which a lot of employers still are not doing this, they're going to keep it to their own records, and they're going to determine very quickly whether you owe the penalty or not. And as Ryan said in the last slide, there's going to be no correction process for this. You're just going to be stuck. So it's much cheaper and easier to comply on the front end rather than going and trying to clean this stuff up on the back end. So we do have some best practices because Ryan and I are seeing this every day. One of the things that I am telling every client that I have is to obtain a written waiver. So when you offer coverage to your employee, have them actually sign something saying that they are declining coverage. Ryan has a creative solution if you cannot get those written waivers, though, and you should do it as a belt and suspenders anyway. But Ryan, tell us what you were just telling me about your receipt of offer idea, or what you actually.
One of the issues that we're confronting is we do have a lot of clients who have not offered insurance in the past, and they're sort of just doing the bare minimum to comply with the ACA, which is fine because that's all the law requires. So they're almost all expecting the offer of coverage to be declined. But what we want to make sure happens is that the employee actually reviews the offer, because we don't want a situation to occur where the client is offering the employee coverage and saying, okay, sign this within 5 minutes, and not really reviewing the offer of coverage. So what we've done is we've created sort of like a tear sheet, a cover page, where you have the employee sign saying, I received the offer of coverage. And then there's a separate offer of coverage where the employee can take the offer home and, you know, read the plan document and the SBC and determine if they want to accept or reject coverage. And on that receipt of offer, we say that if this form is not returned by, just pick a date, say 15 days from the receipt of offer, the coverage will be deemed rejected. So that way you kind of have a backup. But we're highly recommending that every offer be collected as well. It's just sort of a backup mechanism. And just with our lower educated employees, we are recommending that a good practice would be maybe to offer the SBC, the summary of benefits and coverage, to the employee with the offer, just so they understand what the coverage actually provides. And the reason we do like the SBC is the government has a template that it released, and all these SBCs are the same. So we view that as a safe mechanism for conveying what the actual coverage provides, and it's just a safeguard for employees saying, oh, I did not understand what the offer entailed.
Yep, that's a great point. And we're going to talk a little bit more on the next, in a couple slides, about offering to employees of all income levels. So we'll talk about that later. But in a minute, just in a second, I want to make sure that we reiterate: you don't get to not offer coverage to employees because you know they're on Medicaid or because you know they're on their spouse's coverage. You still have to offer them coverage. And Ryan's going to get into the details of that. Also, as we talked about, you have to offer to dependents. Don't try to get cute and think that you've got some loophole. You probably don't understand it if you think that you've got a loophole, because there really are none. I'm advising my clients to keep electronic documents. Those of you who are still storing documents on paper in banker's boxes are going to have a really tough time in 3 years when you get audited, and they want to see this one particular record and you don't have any way to easily access it. So keeping electronic records, keeping cloud storage, keeping some kind of searchable file system. There are numerous software products that are coming out right now that are wonderful. I've been meeting with them, with many of them over the last couple of weeks, and they've got document retention, cloud storage, ways to record all of your offers. And I strongly recommend, if you don't have a really good system in place, that you look into one of those, because the money that it's going to save you in penalties is a drop in the bucket. The cost of it is a drop in the bucket compared to the money that it's going to save you in penalties. And then the other best practice, I'm always an advocate of offering a completely compliant plan. Freedom Care is one of these types of programs that they guarantee compliance, because you're basically putting a blanket over your entire full-time workforce. You know that they're compliant. As Ryan talked about earlier, it's a program that is offering both the bare minimum and a bronze plan, so you know that you're compliant both on the A penalty, the B penalty, and the catch-all penalty. But then that one is also in a tax-efficient structure, so that there's it takes all the guesswork out. I'm still seeing way too many insurance brokers and employers who are thinking that they're going to get cute with some strategy that they think is they're going to be okay with, and I just think that we're going to see all of those guys in the news next year. So so offering a compliant plan, I'm a strong advocate of that. And now let's talk about, whom do I have to offer coverage? And this is where Ryan's going to get into more about the regardless of income issue. So Ryan, can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So essentially, if they're a full-time employee, if they're averaging more than 30 hours per week, they have to be offered coverage. I don't care if they're on Medicaid, Medicare, some veteran plan. They're making $2 million a year. They're making $10 a year. If they're a full-time employee, they have to be offered coverage. And every full-time employee is included in this 95% rule when calculating it.
They'll trigger a penalty for you if you think, because I'm still hearing this, believe it or not. Employers saying, well, I'm just having them tell me if they're on their spouse's coverage, and then I'm not offering them coverage. That person can still trigger the penalty for everybody. So you're going to pay the $2,000 penalty for everyone, even the ones you're offering insurance to, if you take a strategy like this that absolutely doesn't work.
Right, that's a great point. The spouse plan is another one that I've heard. And especially the Medicaid, I've seen people promoting products that they can reduce your healthcare costs by putting a bunch of employees on Medicaid, and that might be true, but the people on Medicaid still need to be offered coverage if they're a full-time employee.
Right. So if you're using one of these programs and I've seen these too, that will tell you who would be eligible for Medicaid or not, it's a fine tool if you're using it in the right way. So like Ryan said, if you're still offering them coverage, it's fine to use that tool, and it's a good way to calculate what your penalties would be, because it wouldn't change your penalty under penalty A, but it definitely could change your penalty under penalty B, because that person would never trigger a penalty. But you can't use those tools and use it to not offer coverage. And then dependents, we've talked about that ad nauseum. So you've got to offer coverage to dependents. And if you don't know by now, spouses are not considered dependents, so you do not need to offer insurance to spouses. If you do offer insurance to spouses or dependents, there's no requirement that it be affordable under the terms of the law. So in other words, you can pass on 100% of the cost of the dependent and spouse coverage to the employee. And let's get into now determining full-time status. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then Ryan's going to get into some more deep dive into this. But when you're determining full-time status, you're looking at it simply the hours per week worked or the hours of service paid. So you're counting the hours anytime that you're paying someone to work for you, even if they're on sick leave, even if they're on vacation, those are still considered hours of service. The federal government has given us different measurement methods that we can use because it's going to be too difficult to try to figure this out on a monthly basis or, you know, as we go. So instead, they're allowing you to measure all of the hours over a time period and then look back over that measurement period and see what the average hours were. It's a great tool that made the ACA much more palatable because it would have been impossible without this. The big pitfall that I see that I want to if you're listening to anything, listen to this. If you've heard this idea about the 1560 question, I must have heard it a dozen times within the last week. This is a very scary thing that is being passed around by brokers, being passed around by people who do not understand the law, and it's especially prevalent in industries like farm labor, industries that have a lot of variable hours, seasonal workers, laborers. And the idea is that employers can just employ people and work them, you know, as much as 60 hours a week, and then as soon as they're about to hit the 1560, fire them. That is a really bad strategy, and you are going to get in trouble, and it's going to trigger penalties like you would not believe. The 1560 question, it shouldn't even be called that because it doesn't work that way. And Ryan's going to talk about it in more detail, but I want to warn everybody that if you're hearing that you can get out of the ACA by just working people up to that number and firing them, that they're dead wrong. So Ryan, why don't you go into the actual measurement of how you get to that 1560 and how you determine if someone's full-time.
Right. You can essentially be classified as 3 employees, excluding seasonal employees for the purpose of this presentation. But you can either be a full-time employee, someone that the employer clearly knows is going to work more than 30 hours per week. You could be a part-time employee, someone that the employer does not know if they're going to work, or someone that the employer knows is going to work less than 30 hours a week. So say you know someone's going to work 20 hours a week. That person's a part-time employee. And the third one is a variable hour employee. And a variable hour employee is a person you don't know if they're going to work 30 hours or more per week. And to determine what the employer is, a part-time, a variable hour, or a full-time, you look at these 3 factors. And the first factor is, you know, is this employee replacing an employee who worked 30 or more hours a week? If they are replacing, say an employee is replacing a person that worked 40 hours a week, that factor is going to point to full-time employee. The second factor is comparable position. So what are the other employees that are similar to this employee working per week? Is it 40 hours? If it's 40 hours a week, that's going to be another factor that points to full-time employee. And the third one is, how is the job advertised, communicated, or documented to the new hire? So how are you, if you have a job that says we are hiring for 60 hours a week, that's going to be another factor that points to full-time employee. And I think the critical thing to know is if the person is a full-time employee, the 1560 rule does not apply to them at all. So if you have a person that you know is going to work, let's just use an extreme example, 60 hours per week, that person must be offered coverage by the conclusion of the 3rd calendar month following the employee's start date. So just to provide an example, if you hire an employee who's going to work 60 hours a week and they start on January 15th, you would have 3 calendar months to offer them coverage. So the first calendar month would be February, The second would be March. The third would be April. By May 1st, that employee would have to be offered coverage, or you would risk paying a penalty under the ACA. So where I think this 1560 rule our 1560 idea came about is for variable hour and part-time employees, you can use a measurement period, something called an initial measurement period, for up to a year, 12 months. So I imagine these quote-unquote consultants figured that 30 hours times 52 weeks comes out to 1560. So if you were not working 1,560 hours per week, that you were not a full-time employee. But that's clearly, it's an egregious misapplication of the law and is going to cause huge penalties for employers that implement it.
I could not agree more, Ryan. And every time I hear consultants, and I'm getting all these flyers across my desk of insurance brokers and ACA consultants pushing this, it gives me heartburn. So I hope that the right people are listening to this and pass this on so that they understand that that is not a viable way. It's a misapplication of the law, and it's not a viable way to deal with the ACA.
Right.
So next, sorry.
I just want one other point on that. So if we're telling our clients, if they're in doubt if the person's a variable hour employee, just offer them coverage by the conclusion of the third calendar month, because that way you are protected under the law.
Yeah, great. Absolutely great point. And also the other thing too to remember is that you have to, there's also some blanket statements being made about, well, no labor contractors are falling under the employer mandate. You can't go with those kind of blanket statements. It's a very individual calculation, and every employer needs to count their own hours, because the ACA consultant who is trying to sell you their services or trying to sell you some product that they're pushing, it doesn't pay the penalty when you find out later that that didn't apply to you. So be very careful when you hear those things, and these are very real things that I just got one yesterday. It's not a viable, it's not good advice, and it's not a viable strategy. You have to measure the hours. If you don't know how to do it, you can contact us. You can contact numerous different attorneys and consultants who are doing the ACA counting. But also these software programs are a great way to do it at a minimal cost when you compare to what your penalties are going to be if you're not in compliance. So with that, let's get on to playing nice with the other laws. As we always talk about, the ACA is not in a vacuum, and simply complying with the ACA does not mean, or violating the ACA does not mean that you may not trigger some other law. And so the biggest thing here when we're talking about offers of coverage, and this is again, Ryan does a lot of these plan documents, and I work on them with him, but he is the plan document guru. When we talk about ERISA, there's ERISA guidelines and rules that have been in effect long before the ACA was ever passed, and it's always been a requirement, or at least for a very long time, that an employer have certain plan documents, and there's certain guidelines that they have to follow when they're creating their benefit program. And so you can't just offer coverage under the ACA and ignore ERISA. You still have to offer insurance in a certain way. You have to, if you're going to create categories, you have to do it in a certain way. You have to offer a plan document. And the Department of Labor is auditing for these things more now than ever before, because as we know, this whole healthcare reform ACA is going to be funded mostly based on penalties. And so all of a sudden what has happened is different departments are saying, well, wow, we can audit for this too, and we can, and there was actually a council, a summit that happened about 2 years ago, and they talked about this very thing, that they are going to start auditing for this more and more, because now, more than ever, because now that employers have to offer coverage, more than ever they should have these plan documents. They always should have, but they didn't, and now they need them. And Ryan, before I go to you, the last thing I'll say is I talked to a broker last week who told me, oh yeah, I've got the plan document. I subscribe to some program, and it's just a form I fill out. And again, my heart stopped, because this is not just a form you fill out. This is a strategic document that outlines your benefit program. And there's a lot of planning that takes place, and there's a lot of decisions that you have to make. And it's something that typically you would contact a benefits attorney or someone who specializes in this to help you make those decisions. So this is not something to, if you are an employer listening to this is not something that if someone says, oh yeah, $50, I'll give you a form, run. And if you are a broker thinking, well, this is a value add I want to offer to my clients, and I don't want to have them pay anything. You're doing them a disservice. You need to refer them to the right resource to have this done properly. This is not something to play around with. And Ryan, you do a ton of these, way more than I do. What do you have to add about these documents?
No, I think you provided a pretty good summary. That these have all been required in the past, and just with an audit being more likely, these are something that you should have readily available when the audit, or if the audit does come, because the last thing you want in an audit is a mistake, because mistakes trigger further intrigue by the auditors, and that's just going to get really costly quickly. And then just
Ryan,
one other
can
final.
You also? Oh, go ahead,
okay,
and then
go
I have
ahead.
another question for you.
Okay. One final point about the plan document is one of the fiduciary requirements under ERISA is the plan document needs to be followed. So if there is an employer that is also, or some person of the employer that's a plan fiduciary, you need to be following the plan document. So if you don't have the plan document, I don't know how you can be following it, because you don't have the plan document. So it's something that not only you need to have, but you need to be familiar with it if you are a plan fiduciary, so you can follow it and comply with ERISA.
And that goes to my point about having a broker, having someone just fill out a form. If they're just filling out a form, it may have nothing to do with your business. It may be completely wrong. And my question for you, Ryan, is can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know you're doing a ton of strategizing with employers. What are they missing out on if they just fill out a form and get a spit back of some document?
Well, I mean, this is kind of what I was just saying. If they don't have the plan document, I don't know how they're implementing the plan as a fiduciary properly, because they don't have the plan document. So there are certain rules that are going to be in the plan document, such as who's eligible for the plan and how an appeal can be filed. Just information that the plan fiduciary should have that is going to be in the plan document. And this is going to be a document that's probably 100 plus pages. It's extremely boring to read, more boring to write, but the employer has to have documents like this.
But in addition just to the fiduciary duties, there's also the planning that takes place. So for example, one of the things that Ryan, you've done with some of our joint clients is you've helped them look differently at their workforce and strategize differently around how they're creating categories, how they are managing their workforce, and in some instances, and in one in particular that I've seen, it saved the employer a substantial amount of money because they just were oblivious to this because nothing ever forced them to look at it before. But by doing the process of the plan document, they learned different ways to manage their workforce, offer their benefits programs in a way that was very beneficial to them.
Right, yeah, you can have additional documents that go on top of the underlying plan document that's going to explain the medical and a bunch of other boring details that categorizes your employees properly. And one of the the biggest reasons we're doing this with a lot of our clients is to protect them from potential ERISA litigation. This is something we've touched on in past webinars, but the ACA does not work or mesh well with other areas of the law. So there's inevitably going to be litigation in this area. So we've put in place some strategies that can go on top of your plan document that are, in our view, a protection against potential litigation.
Great point. And with that, please join us next week. We are doing this webinar every Thursday, and you can go to yourobamacareadvisors.com to register. And again, thank you to our sponsor, Freedom Care Benefits, a completely 100% compliant ACA solution for about $100 per employee per month. If you have a large number of, or you've got a client that has a large number of newly insured employees, I strongly recommend checking out Freedom Care Benefits. It's a very, very solid, interesting program. So with that, Ryan, thank you again for joining me, and we will see you all next week. Thank you.